I think there's often a view in the world at large that they just need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But most of them, if not all, are dealing with a complex series of problems that is very, very challenging.
Welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. It's your girl, Kate, here. This is the place to find inspiring stories of world-changing women and girls every single week. We have a new, unique story coming your way every single week, so make sure that you subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and everywhere you listen to podcasts. One Girl Revolution is a nonprofit multimedia organization that is dedicated to elevating the voices and stories of world-changing women and girls. You can find all of our podcast episodes, watch our Emmy-nominated documentary series, donate to our nonprofit organization to help us continue our critical work to elevate women's voices and their stories, and so much more on our website at onegirlrevolution.com. Go to onegirlrevolution.com today. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I welcome Lisa Simpson, founder of Crossroads for Women. Crossroads for Women is a nonprofit organization based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that provides housing and therapeutic services to empower New Mexico women emerging from incarceration. Their goal is to provide comprehensive, integrated services to empower women emerging from incarceration to achieve safe, healthy, and fulfilling lives in the community for themselves and for their children. Founded Crossroads for Women after she was working on a class action case against the jail, trying to improve conditions for the inmates, particularly those with mental illness. She began to recognize that lawsuits have great power to affect change, but they also have limitations. And there were so many women coming out of jail and prison that needed support and wraparound services to not only get their lives back on track, but for them and their families to thrive. Are the fastest growing population in jail and prison, and many of them keep entering and re-entering because they don't have the support that they need when they get out to find a place to stay, find employment, and begin building or rebuilding a steady life for themselves and for their families. Crossroads for Women is fulfilling that need in New Mexico, and since their founding in 1997, they have been able to help so many women change the trajectory of their lives and the trajectory of generations and generations to come. Lisa shares her own life story, how she got into practicing law, and the pivotal case and suddenly moments that led to the founding of Crossroads for Women. She shares inspiring stories of the work of Crossroads for Women and stories of the women and families they've served, and so much more. This is a really powerful and inspiring episode. You don't want to miss it. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Lisa. Lisa, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I am so excited to have you on to share your story, to talk about the incredible work of Crossroads for Women, how the organization started, all the great work that they're doing. But before we get into that, I would love to rewind and hear a little bit about your own story, Lisa, who you are, where you're from, and just a little bit about your life before Crossroads for Women.
Well, I'm a lawyer by training. And envision doing good things with my work in the law. And I graduated from law school. I clerked at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then took a little bit of a break, sort of traveled a little bit and learned a lot about the world. And then landed in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with a law firm that did primarily Indian law, working for tribes and individuals in New Mexico and elsewhere. But I started to move into doing civil rights work as a plaintiff's attorney, which meant, of course, that I would bring lawsuits for individuals that had been mistreated by the police or by jails or prisons or in employment settings, that kind of work. I started doing more and more civil rights work as opposed to Indian law. And I did a lot of work for individuals who were in jails and prisons. And that included receiving appropriate medical treatment, or being subjected to violence because of a lack of supervision, and various types of cases involving people in jails and prisons. And I eventually began a case with co-counsel representing the subclass of individuals with mental health needs in the jail in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And through that, I became very aware of individuals in jail with mental health needs that were not getting appropriate services in the jail, but also were not getting services in the community so that they could stay out of jail. And so that is what led me to start Crossroads.
It's so important, the work that Crossroads is doing. And like I shared with you before we started recording, we've done a lot of work on this podcast and through One Girl Revolution with our documentary, The Girl Inside, really to tell the real stories, to share the authentic stories and voices of women who are incarcerated or were formerly incarcerated, because that's a population of people that so often gets forgotten about. And it's shocking to me that women and girls are the fastest growing population in jail and prison. And there are so many facets to why that is. But it's often not talked about. And even you bringing up the mental health issues of people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, there aren't enough resources in our world for people. And so sometimes they just end up in jail or prison, and then they get out and then they end up back in because they don't have the resources that they need outside of that. And so it just becomes this circular motion, and we really need to break that and create more resources and find ways to really serve these populations of people, not just those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, but there's so many forgotten about populations. When you're bringing up Native Americans, that's a whole nother population that is so often forgotten about. And so, we need to be having these conversations. So I'm grateful for all of the work that you've done, and it's amazing. So you're working on this case, and then when did you get the idea for Crossroads for Women? Was there a spark moment? Was it a variety of spark moments? Maybe it was throughout your career, you started kind of connecting the dots and seeing the need for this organization. How did it start?
Well, it probably wasn't a spark moment. It was through working on this class action for individuals with mental illness and seeing what you just described, the revolving door of people becoming somewhat stabilized while in jail, because through the lawsuit, we were improving the mental health services within the jail. So we could see that at least some individuals were getting stabilized, getting on medications, not using for at least some period of time, using drugs. And then they would be released, and there was nothing in the community to support that stability that they had attained. And so we would see them come back in. We monitored the conditions in the jail long enough to see that revolving door. And it was particularly true of women, I would say. As you said, women represent the fastest growing segment of jail population. And that really started in the 1990s, where, at least for us in New Mexico, we went from really just having a handful of women in the jail, like 30 or so, and just saw it climb rapidly till at the end of the 1990s when we started Crossroads. It was more like 150 and then going to 200. And there were very few programs in the community for women. There were some for men, still not enough. But I think at that time, there was only one program in Albuquerque that really focused on supporting women coming out of jail or prison. And that was a capacity of about 6 or 10 women. So really not close to the needed resources. And so it was that seeing that and seeing the women come back and getting to know them and talking to them about what they faced when they were about to be released and how they hope to maintain some stability in the community. And no matter how hopeful they were, how pessimistic they were about actually being able to be able to create a stable life in the community.
There are so many things that individuals coming out of jail and prison have to deal with, right? Where am I going to sleep? Where am I going to get a job? Will anybody hire me? And there are so many facets even to, women. I think what's really fascinating about women and girls is there's usually another motivating factor, right? Like they don't just go in and rob a grocery store. They're usually trying to feed their kids. Maybe they have a boyfriend or partner or someone else who's kind of pushing them into this. And so it's just a fascinating study to me of, why are these women ending up in such large numbers in jail and prison? And then why do that revolving door, they keep ending back in? But a lot of it are the things that we're talking about, where it's like they don't know where they're going to stay. A lot of them have kids, right? And they're trying to get their kids back if that's a situation. And now it's great to see so many organizations that are starting to do that work in different states and then also across the country, whether it's Motherhood Beyond Bars, that are building community between mothers who are incarcerated and their babies and children outside, and really building community, but figuring out like, what do they need when they get out? How can we make sure that their kid comes back? How can we make sure that they have a job or, that they have an apartment to stay in? The IF Project is amazing out of Washington State. They're doing same stuff. And Crossroads for Women. I mean, you're really answering the needs of women and girls who are coming out of jail and prison situations. So how did it become an organization? Like, I know that you were seeing the need. When did you say, you know what, this has to be something bigger? Now I know it's grown so much since you founded it. Even looking at the website, it's incredible. All the staff that you have and all the different programming, there's so much going on. But when was that moment where you were like, this is an organization, like we want to start this as a nonprofit organization. We want to serve this community and build from there?
I want to address that, but I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of what leads the women into these situations. And I want to add one thing to what you mentioned, and that is the history of trauma. That the vast majority, if not all, of the women in jail and prison have a history of trauma, most likely childhood trauma, physical and emotional, and often sexual, as well as adult trauma. And that trauma most often leads to some form of mental illness. That mental illness often leads to addiction. And so there's really a very complex web of issues that are following these women and need to be addressed for them to stabilize. So I think there's often a view in the world at large that they just need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But most of them, if not all, are dealing with a complex series of problems that is very, very challenging.
Yeah.
And some very good work on that, which I'm sure you know about, Stephanie Covington, Lisa Nahavitz, and more, and attachment disorders, Gabor Mate. So it's very challenging. It's not easy for them. It's not easy for the organizations that work with them.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of when we decided to form an organization, and I say we because I was in my law practice with my law partner, Susan Tomita, and we actually had a case settle that involved a pretty good chunk of attorney's fees, and it was a civil rights case. And she and I together decided to set aside a big part of those attorney's fees to start Crossroads for Women. And we didn't know the exact contours of it at that time. In the case that settled, I was working with a social worker, and I asked her to assist me in figuring out what this program was going to look like. Her name was Jenny Gilmer. And the first thing we did was a needs assessment. And so we went into the jail and interviewed a number of women to figure out what their needs on the street would be. And about the same time, we also did an assessment of what resources were in the community that we could access. Because even though we set aside a good chunk of money, it wasn't going to last long to actually provide the wraparound services that we envisioned. And our biggest concern was housing, that we really envisioned that it would be housing with wraparound services, that you really couldn't address the needs of this population if they were living on the streets or living in a crack house or going back to a family or support system that was not a positive support system. And so we, one of the interviews I did was with the local housing coalition. And I recall that his words were, "I think you'll find that housing is a gap in services." And so then we figured we were going to have to provide housing, and that would eat up the money pretty quickly. But at any rate, we took the leap, and we opened our doors. It started with one client and then added a few more. We applied for grants. Our first grant was $1,200 from the Albuquerque Community Foundation, which obviously $1,200 doesn't go very far, but it gave us some credibility in the community, and we continued to apply for other grants. The big leap was when we received a HUD grant so that we could actually provide housing. I believe it was to about 25 women. And that was when we really got started.
Watch One Girl Revolution's Emmy-nominated short documentary, The Girl Inside, on our YouTube channel or at onegirlrevolution.com. The Girl Inside features a poignant look at the stories of incarcerated women within Cook County Jail and a life-changing academic course taught by Dr. Laura Biaggi called Storytelling as a Healing Art. This short documentary reunites Dr. Biaggi with 5 of her former students for a special one-day course on the transformative power of our stories and our voices. And what is revealed is the girl inside. Watch the Emmy-nominated short documentary The Girl Inside today on YouTube or at onegirlrevolution.com.
But it was sort of nerve-wracking because we then had this housing, but I'm not a social worker, and I didn't have the kind of clinical guidance that we needed. And so about the same time, the New Mexico Department of Health gave us a grant that allowed us to hire a part-time, half-time clinical director. So that was when things started to come together, and we started to become a legitimate agency providing these services.
It's so incredible, even thinking about that small grant, $1,200. And I'm sure it was so stressful, those different points that you mentioned. Even when you're housing people, it's like a lot of us struggle even with paying rent, each month. It's like, okay, how do I pay rent? But now you're housing all of these women who are trying to get their lives back on track and offering housing, but now we have to build in these wraparound services. And I think that's what's so unique about the work that you're doing. And there are a couple of other organizations that are doing amazing work like that, but you can't just house somebody. You have to then offer these wraparound services. And just for people that are listening, I'm just going to read this off your website because I think it gives a really clear picture for Crossroads for Women. The mission of Crossroads for Women is to provide comprehensive, integrated services to empower women emerging from incarceration to achieve safe, healthy, and fulfilling lives in the community for themselves and their children. It's so incredible. And even I think about with regards to women have so much power. And I would say any individual, but when I'm looking at women, especially through the lens of One Girl Revolution, women are so resilient. We're so powerful. And a lot of times we just need someone to pay attention to us or help us, like give us the one step to get back on track. And I know that with the women that you're working with, you've worked with, you're offering that one step, but the power that has when one woman steps on track for her life, it can not only affect her life and the trajectory of her life, but her children's lives, her children's children. And so women, not just when it comes to incarceration, not, anything that we're talking about, whether it's addiction or mental health struggles or, women getting out of domestic violence, abusive situations, women are so powerful. If they take that step and they really get their life back on this trajectory, they can change the lives of generations and generations to come, which I think is so unique and beautiful and special.
Very definitely true. And I've always been amazed with the women that we served at Crossroads and that Crossroads continues to serve, at their strength, their courage, their talents. And we certainly try to build on that. I mean, that's one of the theories of recovery, is to use a strength-based approach. And that is what we attempt to do. And my successor, Casey Quirk, really took that a step farther than we did. I mean, I like to think that my successors built on what we started, but they brought their own strengths to it. And one of the things that Casey did was she really worked on developing the advocacy skills of the women in the program. And so they worked with an organization called Young Women United to kind of develop those advocacy skills. And they went to the legislature and advocated for different bills to assist this population. And there's nothing stronger than hearing the voices of the women who have been through this and have come out the other side and know what it takes. So that's something that we started when I was there, but I would say my successors really built on that and sort of took that to another level.
That's what I think the best thing that you can hope for, right? Is that you want somebody who's going to bring their own talent, their own perspective, and make things better than we left it. I think that's amazing, and it's been probably incredible to watch as Crossroads for Women has continued on. I know you're still involved in the work that they're doing in a variety of different ways, but what can you tell me about Crossroads for Women now? I know that now it's taken a little while, but it's been incredible what you've accomplished in many years now, since its founding. But what can you tell me about Crossroads for Women now and the programs and the work that Crossroads for Women does?
Well, it's really been amazing how they've grown. Going back, we started with scattered site housing for about 23 women, and we added a residential program for 12 women. So women that needed sort of a more structured, more supportive environment than can be provided in scattered site apartments could get that and then move on to the scattered site. So that was already in the works. But now they've just grown incredibly. They have they've moved that that residential site to a larger facility so that they're serving, I think, 25 people in that site. But they've also opened an additional facility south of Albuquerque for women coming directly out of prison as opposed to jail. And that, I'm not sure I remember the exact number they serve, but it's 30 or so. And they've expanded the number of scattered site apartments they have. I believe it's up to like 60 or 70. So just in terms of the number that they're serving, it's grown rapidly, but also the breadth of services. They have a very good vocational services set up, both with vocational counseling, but also with on-site computer labs and things of that sort. A lot of family services and childhood services. And they have this new facility that's just beautiful, and it has sites for children. And that was something new when we started, is that there were no programs in Albuquerque that served women with children. And as you probably know, a lot of women can't commit or won't commit to any kind of inpatient or residential services if it means separating from their children. So that was an important attribute. And that, of course, has continued and expanded. They also do currently walk-in services related to housing to try to get people who are at risk of losing their housing or who have lost their housing back into housing quickly. And that's not limited to people who are in the Crossroads program. That's anybody, any woman who needs those services. So they've really expanded both in the number of people served and the number of services offered.
It's absolutely
I
incredible.
will say one of the things that pleases me the most as a founder is that our goal in developing the Crossroads model was to provide a nurturing, supportive environment. And that's harder to do than it sounds, because I think there's sort of a natural tendency to say, oh, if you do this, you have to have consequences, and we have to be strict and all of that. And the literature is really not supportive of that kind of penal approach, but it's hard to stay in that nurturing, supportive place. And I think we did it when we started, and that's a part of it that has really stayed true to that mission, that despite all of their growth and all of the bureaucracy that goes with it, they've really maintained a very supportive, nurturing environment.
That's so beautiful. And that's what women really need. I think, we need that tough love at times, right? Where it's like, okay, listen, I know that you said you were going to do this, like you need to do it, but really from a nurturing, loving perspective. Lisa, how does Crossroads for Women get connected to the women? I know you've mentioned a couple of different ways, like even that some women now can walk in with regards to the housing services, but can you talk about how does Crossroads for Women get connected to the women?
Well, I think it's changed a little bit over the years. When we first started, we were very intent upon doing what's called in-reach. So going into the jail, we provided a program in the jail, and then when somebody was interested in the program, we would begin a treatment planning process in the jail. So being present in the jail was a big part of connecting with the women and developing that trust. And in the very beginning, that was in part by working with this individual in the jail. His name was Gordon Bernal, and he was in charge of program services and was just a wonderful man who cared very deeply for the individuals in the jail, and particularly the women. And I think having his connection allowed women to trust us. But it mushroomed very quickly because, again, there were so few services in the community that learning of this service, people approached us and wanting to participate very quickly. And Crossroads still does in-reach in the jail. So they're doing programming in the jail. They do treatment planning before people are released. They work more in the prison than we did when I was director. And I don't know if they provide any programming in the prison. I think not. But they are definitely well known to the women in the prison system.
Yeah, there comes a point where it's like, if they're well known, it's like you don't necessarily have to keep cultivating that. And women are great connectors. We know that. So even I'm sure that their word spreads quickly, and you know, it's just continued to grow, and women are connecting points for so many others. Lisa, I know that you have probably so many stories through the years, and now you're hearing about stories that Crossroads for Women, you know, the successes or the women that they're working with. But is there a story or two of a woman or women that particularly touched your heart, or that you look at and you're like, that's exactly why we do what we do every single day? That's why Crossroads for Women exists, that you could share?
Yes. And before talking about an individual, I want to say another thing that my successors have done, which really required the passage of time, is that they have a very large percentage of their staff that are graduates of Crossroads. And I'm not sure what the percentage is, but I think they have over a dozen staff members who are graduates of Crossroads. And of course, that's something that we really like to see. I mean, one, it's a tribute to their strength and their recovery, but also it's so helpful to women coming into the program to have this model in their support system of women who have been through the same thing. And in fact, the assistant director now is a graduate of Crossroads. So that's sort of in a global sense, that is something that is very important to us and to Crossroads. So just briefly, because it's been some time since I've been involved in the front lines of this work, but one of our very first clients was a woman who had 3 children in Colorado, and ended up finding herself here in sort of a drug-fused passage. And she was in jail. She was pregnant. She was scared. She was on the mental health wing at the jail. We interviewed her in the jail, and her needs, I think, were probably more than we could handle, but we didn't really know that at the time. And she took us on a bit of a roller coaster ride. And she actually was very strong-willed, is a strong-willed woman, and had significant PTSD and other mental health diagnoses. Anyway, like I said, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride. But the reason she comes to mind is because she actually lost the child that she was pregnant with to this state. And her children in Colorado had been lost to the state before that. And the reason she comes to mind is because as her children got older and her life stabilized, she was in an apartment, she had a car, she was on disability, but had figured out how to maintain a life in that regard. And as her children got older and Facebook became part of our lives, she reconnected with her children in Colorado and the child here, and has since become a grandmother and is a part of their lives, and they're a part of her life. Family was just so important to her. And the fact that she didn't have a family, she had been abandoned. And the stories of these women are all so tragic. I had to quit doing intakes because I just started crying. And she had been abandoned by her mother and then left at a shelter by her father. Before that, she had lived out of the car. She would beg for money and such to support her father. And he eventually just dropped her off at a shelter. She was abused in a foster care setting. So she kind of had it all. But what she wanted more than anything was family. And so to see her actually reconnect with her mother, even though that was a bit of an unstable situation, but also reconnect with her children was just very moving. The other one that comes to mind, because Crossroads serves quite a few Indigenous women. For people that don't know, New Mexico has, I believe, 19 or 20 reservations, including part of the Navajo reservation, several Apache reservations, and many Pueblo reservations. And so there have been a number of amazing stories of women coming from these reservations and struggling in the same way that many of the women struggle, but in addition, having this cultural divide and cultural needs that aren't often met. And so there was one woman we had who was from one of the reservations, and she had been abused by a family member and fled the reservation, but that was always a real hole in her life because that was very important to her. She had an older son and a very young son when she came to us, and she got stabilized and found a way to reconnect with her family on the reservation, even though that was part of the abusive situation. I remember one of her fondest moments was when she shared with us that she was going to dance in one of the ceremonial dances back on the reservation. And that was so important to her to reconnect with her Indigenous culture. Yet came from her recovery to where she could do that.
What a beautiful full circle moment for her. And I love hearing those stories. And I know it's so difficult, right? Like all of our life stories are rocky. Life is not easy. But really hearing these stories of women who are reconnecting to their families or reconnecting to their own lives and who they are as people, right? As individuals, I'm a firm believer that each and every one of us has a unique purpose on this planet. And if we, we're as unique as our fingerprint, and if we really believed that, how differently we would live our lives. And so it's beautiful to hear those stories of women who are just like reconnecting with the person that they were created to be and getting their lives back on track.
Donate to One Girl Revolution's nonprofit organization to help us continue our work, highlighting inspiring women and girls that are changing the world through their lives, promoting their work and their organizations, and building a powerful and positive force out in the world, dedicated to empowering women, their voices, and their stories. Donate at onegirlrevolution.com/donate. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com/donate.
Lisa, I know that Crossroads for Women has grown and evolved so much, probably to your wildest dreams already. I know that when you founded it, you never thought probably that it would be where it is now. But if you could just dream for a second, where do you hope that Crossroads for Women goes from here? And what impact do you hope that Crossroads for Women continues to have on the world?
Well, I think Crossroads has gone to a place that I had not imagined when we started it in that little fledgling program. I think they're on track to be what they need to be. I guess I would say that there are some gaps in the community. So, for example, I don't think the community, including Crossroads, really reaches that really young population. The average age of women going out on the streets is like 14, 15, 16 years old. And Crossroads isn't really even designed to reach minors. That's something that needs to be worked on. I think that the community lacks the full spectrum of residential services. And so Crossroads, it probably isn't yet reaching some of the women with the highest level of needs in terms of mental health and cognitive disabilities. I think we need group homes to do that, and more single site supportive housing, some residential services. We need more detox services, residential addiction services. So as a community, we still need a broad range of services and more of each of them. And to the extent Crossroads can fill that gap, that would be great. And of course, we, like many communities, have need for more providers. I mean, that kind of goes in another direction, but to whatever Crossroads can do to sort of foster an interest in pursuing this line of work and getting the education and credentialing that's needed would be important. So I guess I look at it from a community level. There are still so many needs in our community, as in most, and anything that Crossroads can do to fill those gaps would be great.
You're filling so many gaps. And I think it's always good to be introspective too, and say, like, you're talking about, where are the other gaps that we haven't filled yet? What are things we can be doing? And what I love so much about Crossroads for Women is you're also not recreating the wheel in some aspects. It's like, who can we work with? What are other organizations that are out there? And that's what I love so much about this community of One Girl Revolution. So many organizations have worked together. I'm sure that people that we've had on this podcast before have worked with you, or vice versa. And it's just amazing the impact that we can have. You found an organization, and you can't do everything or be everything to everyone, but how can we really innovate, and how can we connect with one another and build a strong community of support for women? So, Lisa, what can people do to support Crossroads for Women? I know there are a lot of different ways. Donations is one of them, but can you talk about what people can do to support the great work of Crossroads for Women?
Well, as you mentioned, donations are always appreciated. And for those in the local community, Crossroads utilizes volunteers in all different respects. Whether it's helping out with the front desk, or assisting with childcare, or with organizing the clothing donations. Lots of volunteer opportunities. And, the other thing I think that is really important, and is true in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, which is where Albuquerque is, but also in every community, is to really advocate with your local governments about the needs for of this population. The country all over is dealing with unsheltered crisis. And a lot of those unsheltered individuals are people with mental illness, with addiction, are people that are revolving through the jail. And it's easy for people to be frustrated with that population. They don't like having to see them on the sidewalks or in the parks. But it's really important to advocate for really addressing the underlying issues and the underlying needs of that population, and not encourage government to take a policing approach, because that's not going to work, for one thing. It may move them from one place to another, but it's not going to address the underlying issues. And the bottom line is that it really is going to take funding to serve the needs of that population, and that has to be seen as a priority. And to the extent people can advocate for that in their local communities, that's really important.
We can all do something like you've shared, and I've talked about that on this podcast, specifically with regards to incarceration, whether it's advocating, but even getting involved in your own community. And I had somebody on the podcast who made it her mission that she would write birthday cards to her local jail and prison. There's little things like that it might seem like a little thing, but it's such a big thing, or during COVID, I know different moms were making their kids, like as a part of their homeschool, because everybody was stuck at home, having their kids draw pictures and sending it to the local senior living facilities, but also to the local jails and prisons. Just, you never know what one little thing that you do could make a difference. And there are also so many opportunities for people to teach classes. I know Inside Out is a great organization that works with professors and people with their master's degrees, or anyone that can kind of teach things, to go into jails and prisons, to teach courses, to teach classes that a lot of these individuals, it's not just women, get college credit for, or get some sort of, find their new purpose in life, so they get out with some new skills. And so we can all do something. And you're just such a beautiful example of that, Lisa. And I'm so grateful to have had you on the podcast. I want to know from you, you've worked in this field for so long, you've worked as an attorney, there's so much going on, but you obviously care so deeply about this issue, especially, incarceration and women and girls who are being incarcerated. What is at the very root? Like, what is the driving force of why you care about this issue and why you do what you do? Maybe it goes back to that original suit that you were working on, but what is at the very root of why you do what you do and why you care about this issue?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I would say that from an early age, I wanted to do something that made a difference, to help people. And in terms of zeroing in on this population, it had seemed to me that it was a population that really was kind of seen as on the garbage heap. That it's easy to get around homeless children. It's easy to get support around homeless pets. But it can be hard to encourage support for people in jail and people coming out of jail, and prisoners and prostitutes. And it just seemed like a population that was forgotten, or people wanted to forget. And so that became the challenge.
It's a forgotten about population that needs to be talked about. And so I'm so grateful to have had you on the podcast to share your incredible story, and also about the incredible work of Crossroads for Women. Lisa, you're a one girl revolution, which is obviously why I wanted to have you on the podcast. But who is a one girl revolution to you? Who's a woman or girl that inspires you?
I think historically, Dorothy Day is somebody that is inspirational. And she really dedicated her life to making a difference for people in really tough, rough situations. So I would say she's maybe a role model that I'll never achieve, but is certainly something to aspire to.
Well, I think that you are achieving it, and she's just such an incredible woman, and it's beautiful to see her legacy continue on, right? Her example, the work that she's done, and I know that's the same with you, and where Crossroads for Women goes from here. I can't wait to see where it goes. I can't wait to continue to support the work that you're doing, and the team at Crossroads for Women. They're all incredible. I will put the website, the social media links, all the ways that people can get involved in your work in the show notes for this episode. But before I let you go, Lisa, I always end this podcast on one question. So I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
I guess it would be to take the leap, to, what you feel you want to do, what you see that needs to be done. It can seem very daunting, and you can prepare for it, but eventually you have to take the leap, and it's something that you can do. You can achieve your goals if you put your mind to it.
You are such a beautiful example of that. And I can't wait to see where everything goes with Crossroads for Women. And again, can't wait to support it, continue to follow everything that you're doing, and stay in touch with you. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the One Girl Revolution podcast. And thank you for all the incredible work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number one girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number one girlrevolution.com.